What is the Watchmen? Like, what are they? Why are they important? These are a lot of the questions that some individuals have been asking because, simply put, The Watchmen is a rather old story. It simply is. It came out in 1986 and 1987, and while it is an extremely famous storyline, it was never truly continued until DC brought out the Before Watchmen series. But before we can talk about that, and the disaster that is the Watchmen copyright situation, we need to explain what the Watchmen is in general. So let's get started. Watchmen is a story that reflects contemporary anxieties and parodies the superhero concept. The story is an alternate take on our own world, and it happens within the 1980s. Basically, think of their universe like this. What if superheroes were actually real? Not in comic books real and in our movies, but actually really real, like you could go touch a superhero. It was sanctioned by the government and everything. That's the big difference in the Watchmen universe. And it all started back in 1938. You see, with the use of superheroes, certain events like World War I and II and the Vietnam War play out much differently. But eventually, the public grew tired of vigilantes, and there was a ban on superheroes in 1977, as most of them are just costume people running around doing whatever they want for their own reasons, be it justice or revenge. At the start of the story, we only have the Comedian and Dr. Manhattan still operating as superheroes for the government, and Rorschach is operating outside of the law. Bear in mind, in this universe, Dr. Manhattan is the only super-powered individual. The movie did portray the heroes as being a little beyond a normal human in terms of their strength and speed, but that just made for a more interesting movie with better fight scenes. In the comic books, they're all just real people. Now, Watchmen is a series created by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons with colorist John Higgins. Alan Moore originally requested the use of the characters from the Charlton Comics, a publication that DC had recently acquired at that time. But as you may or may not know, within the story of the Watchmen, this would lead to many of those characters being unusable in future storylines. So it was proposed that Alan Moore create his own superheroes to tell this story, and thus he created an entire history of superheroes within the Watchmen. He made an entire universe, multiple superheroes, heroes who are retired, heroes who are still operating, what happened to their parents and their loved ones, an entire history for superheroes that had not previously existed, because he felt that the only way that the Watchmen would be effective as a story is if you had an understanding of these characters and their entire history. What was originally going to be a 6-issue story turned into a 12-issue story with origin stories peppered in between everything else that was going on. He created an entire universe, and it was kind of effective. The Watchmen became known as one of the most significant works of 20th century literature, and it's even listed as one of the 100 best novels on the Times Magazine Best English Novels list. BBC described it as the moment that comic books grew up, and that comment alone will help you realize how important The Watchmen is. You see, the 80s were the moment that comic books really changed, with titles like Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, and even on a lesser scale, Final Crisis. You didn't have mass death, multiple characters dying. You didn't have deep and heavy stuff happening with your superheroes. Comics were basically just fun little adventures for children, mostly at that point. And there were adult comic books, but they were just a subgenre of the comic book genre. It was around the 80s that they became a respected type of entertainment. Now, I really want to say more on this, but if you truly want to understand the impact of the Watchmen series on comic books and society as a whole, there are actual books and essays which fully analyze the entire thing. Maybe one day we'll make a video on it, but honestly, it wouldn't be like something we've ever done if we did that. It would be a massive video, fully deep diving into the entire concept of what the Watchmen did. If you want an example, check out Minutes to Midnight, 12 essays on Watchmen. It's orderable on Amazon, and there's over 100 essays and studies on the internet as a whole. The story itself was a single one-and-done 12-issue storyline that was well received, and back in 1985, Alan Moore stated that if the Watchmen storylines were well received, he would write a prequel entitled The Minutemen. It would chronicle the first group of superheroes in this universe mentioned within the storyline of the Watchmen, and it would be the rise of the superheroes within this world through this Minutemen team. As time went on, DC also offered Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons the chance to write other prequels, such as Rorschach's Journal and the Comedian's Vietnam War Diary. But you see, there was an issue. DC Comics owned Watchmen as long as they kept publishing it. And it was such a massive success that this led to it continually being published for years. Think of it as the X-Men situation with Fox and Marvel. Fox keeps cranking out those X-Men movies just to maintain the rights to the property. Alan Moore wanted the rights to the Watchmen back. This was his baby. He created an entire universe and he wasn't allowed to do anything with it without DC's okay. This was a time when a comic book writer just didn't self-publish or go through another company, such as Image Comics, to maintain the rights to their characters and concepts. So, since DC continually published Watchmen, they owned the Watchmen and the universe that they resided in. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons both felt that the stories that DC was presenting wouldn't be able to go anywhere and they wouldn't be any good, so they didn't want to write any of those sequels or prequels that DC was offering. And they turned all those offers down, so the Watchmen universe was left to sit. In 2010, Alan Moore told Wired that DC had offered him the rights to Watchmen, but he would have to agree to write prequel and sequel projects and expand the universe. He said that if they had offered that 10 years earlier, when he asked for it, he probably would have taken it. But these days, he doesn't want the Watchmen back, and certainly not under those terms. Even though he turned it down, DC decided to move forward with the Watchmen universe, as their plan was to, as long as they could create content that they considered as high of quality as the original storyline. Then, 2 years later, DC announced the Before Watchmen line of comics. The stories would explain the backstories to some of the most popular characters and concepts within the Watchmen universe. Dave Gibbons came out and said that he felt that the original story was a complete story and it didn't need anything else, but he appreciates and understands DC's reasons for doing this, and he wishes them successes in their new additions to the universe. Alan Moore, on the other hand, wasn't exactly happy, and he publicly stated that the whole thing was completely shameless, and he didn't want money for it, he just didn't want it to happen. He felt that the original story was a brief special moment in comics. It wasn't like other comic books of its time or even now. It stood on its own and had the integrity of a literary work. But now DC decided to make it a regular comic that will run indefinitely and have spin-offs. Nevertheless, DC proceeded as planned, releasing stories around the Minutemen, Silk Spectre, Comedian, Night Owl, Ozymandias, Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, Moloch, and Dollar Bill. I'll explain each of these characters in other videos, but they are the main elements of the storyline, and I wanted you to understand where we currently stand with this universe. And that brings us to today. Before Watchmen, and the idea of continuing the entire Watchmen brand was a mixed bag of success. I have a feeling, and this is a speculation, that DC thought it would be a huge thing, hugely accepted, bolstering sales large enough to launch an entire line of Watchmen comics beyond all of these minis, but it never achieved the level of success that the original story did. Maybe it was due to it being so old. There were so many new comic book readers that had never even heard of it. Or maybe it was due to the fact that the books themselves in the miniseries weren't telling any real massive groundbreaking storylines. Overall, DC needed a new plan, a way to make people become amazed by the Watchmen and introduce them to a new generation of comic book readers. Alongside this, they had other issues within their company as well. The New 52 had launched a couple of years prior, and while its launch was a massive success, there were a lot of timeline and continuity problems that the fans had been complaining about. They were really starting to poke through. DC was beginning to lose that steam that they had gained from their massive relaunch, and they weren't quite sure how to correct the issue. They tried a few things, such as big universe-spanning events, and then they tried the DCU initiative, which was an attempt to say, forget continuity, here's stories that are just interesting. Nothing really worked out that well, so they devised the DC Rebirth plan. And while DC Rebirth is doing a great job of correcting timeline issues by bringing back old things that we loved and putting things back to where they should be, there's one noticeable thing that they are incorporating into the DC universe proper. They are introducing a whole new generation of readers to. That's the Watchmen. If you've been keeping up with the DC Rebirth clues and hints, you'll notice some very telling elements popping up. And we made an entire video giving you each and every one of those clues. They've done things like take lines right out of the Watchmen comics. And you know, there's always that big blue hand. While this is only my theory, I believe DC is using DC Rebirth as a way to introduce a whole new world to the Watchmen, and once again try to continue the stories and legacy of those characters. Once this whole DC Rebirth event ends, unless some crazy stuff happens, the characters of the Watchmen Watchmen really wouldn't do that well in the DC universe proper long term. Their entire concept is a world where superpowers just don't exist. But what if you introduce everyone of the Watchmen cast and then return them to their universe? We get all kinds of new Watchmen comics. I mean, it's just a theory, a comic theory, but it's still just a theory. The Watchmen is an interesting story. One of a man creating a beloved piece of literature for a company, and then that company refusing to relinquish the rights to him. A story of a company trying to continue a legacy that they didn't create. A story of a world of characters and concepts that fans are starving to get more of. But who's in the right and the wrong in this matter? Legally, DC owns the Watchmen and they can do whatever they want with them. Should they leave it alone or continue on a world that fans want? It looks like regardless of your opinions, we're going to be seeing more of the Watchmen and the characters from that universe soon. So give this video a like if you want me to begin exploring the before Watchmen series, the characters' origins, and the original comic run itself. I would like to, but it's really not something that we've done before, so I wanted to gauge your reaction with this overview video, helping people understand what exactly it is that we're about to be diving into if you're